Horror movies have always had to accomplish a lot with a little, with filmmakers pulling off miracles to deliver movies that are gorgeous and terrifying in equal measure. However, audiences these days can pause to scrutinize a crystal clear freeze frame of any cinematic moment, which can sometimes completely break the illusion or highlight something terrifying you totally missed. Of course, we're going to be doing a lot of the former today, but I just want to stress that this isn't to insult the dedicated artists who pulled off these scenes, and instead it's just a bit of fun to see how the sausage was made. I'm Josh from What Culture Horror, and these are 30 horror movies and TV shows you must never pause. The Doll of Nancy's Mother, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of the most stylish and creative horror films of all time, and though the overwhelming majority of its reality-bending effects remain totally convincing today, Freddy leering through the wall, for instance, is still awesome, and his makeup has never looked better. There is one that has been downright laughable ever since the film's 1984 release. The movie's ambiguous ending sees Nancy driving off to school with her miraculously resurrected school friends as the car's very Krueger-esque hood comes down. In a final scare, Nancy's mother Marge is suddenly attacked by Freddy, who impossibly drags her body through a small window in the front door of her house. Now, even in motion, it's hilariously obvious that we're looking at a doll here, but when paused, you can see just how embarrassingly cheap and low effort the prop really is. After hundreds of watches, I'm still not sure if it's supposed to be purposefully funny or what, but hey, it's memorable alright, I'll give it that. And terrible though the 2010 remake mostly was, its CGI-driven reimagining of this ending is admittedly a lot less goofy, so I guess that's the one pro of that movie. Michael Myers' CGI mask, Halloween H2O 20 years later. Compared to most other Halloween sequels, the 7th film was actually relatively solid, though it made the egregious, unforgivable mistake of relying on CGI, something the series hadn't much done before. The main issue was that even once shooting was underway, the director still hadn't settled on a final mask design for Michael Myers, and ended up using 3 practical masks throughout production, all of which are noticeable in various scenes, as well as an additional CGI mask. So, for the scene where Charlie bumps into Michael, actor Chris Durand was wearing one of the masks which was ultimately discarded, and because the scene called for close-up shots of Myers' mask, there was no way to disguise the fact that he was wearing the wrong one. Without the ability to just reshoot the scene, the decision was made to superimpose a digital mask over the top that better represented the main design used throughout the rest of the movie. The shot only lasts around a second or so, but it's absolutely horrible, and it's tough to believe that whatever was shot practically was less of a distraction than this. I mean, it's not quite Henry Cavill mustache bad, but it's still pretty bad. The Babadook is always watching. The Babadook. The Babadook is one of those horror movies whose secrets continue to reveal themselves on every rewatch. The horror story about the titular monster coming to life from his own storybook features plenty of blink and you'll miss them scares, and moving away from scenes that don't hold up for just a split second, we're going to highlight some of the most effective scenes that get even scarier when you pause them. First and most famous comes towards the end, when our hero Amelia looks out of her kitchen window and into the house of her elderly next door neighbor. The first time she looks up, she sees her neighbor watching the TV with a dark hallway behind her. The second time she looks up though, she catches a brief flash of Mr. Babadook himself where the darkness previously was. It's a great sequence, and pausing it only makes it more unnerving as you get a greater look of the monster in detail. There's another moment that gets freakier when paused as well, and that's when Amelia is watching an old silent movie only to have Mr. Babadook become a part of it for a few seconds. No thank you. The awkward cat attack. Let the Right One In. Let the Right One In is without a doubt one of the greatest horror films of the last 20 years, yet despite how artfully brutal it mostly is, there is one scene that's let down by some cringy visual effects. After Virginia is attacked by Eli and turned into a vampire, she visits a friend's apartment only to be attacked by her many cats. Though the scene is supposed to be blackly comedic, the use of horribly unconvincing CGI felines renders the scene a very different kind of funny, where you're chuckling at how rudimentary the effects are rather than the absurdity of a woman being mauled by a pack of cats. Thankfully, the movie's effects are otherwise sublime, but that only ensures that this scene sticks out like a sore thumb every single time. Rick's eyeball pops out. Friday the 13th Part 3. The Friday the 13th movies get a fair degree of leeway here because they were all made relatively cheaply, but still, given that the third entry into the series was given quadruple the budget of the original film, it is fair to assume that it should have boasted effortlessly superior gore effects, right? Well, sadly not. One of the film's most memorable death scenes sees poor Rick have his head crushed so hard by Jason that one of his eyeballs pops out. And because the threequel was made for a 3D presentation, of course, Rick's eye flies out towards the audience, which is, as we all know, a timeless gag. To be fair, it is a neat idea, especially for the time, but the execution is just way off. Because in addition to the extremely visible wire that the eyeball is traveling across, Rick's prop head looks nothing like an actual human being. It isn't great in motion, but when poured over as a still, it's legitimately hilarious. Miss Burke's decapitated tentacle head. The Faculty. Robert Rodriguez's cult classic sci-fi horror film may not take itself particularly seriously, being an homage to classic alien invasion thrillers as it is, but there are nevertheless some unintentional cackles to be had from its poorly aged CGI. As Zeke attempts to escape from alien-controlled teacher Miss Burke, he ends up crashing his car, catapulting Burke herself out the window, and seemingly killing her. But moments later, Zeke sees Burke's head, attached to a bunch of alien tentacles, crawling all over her decapitated body and putting itself back together. It's a cool, gruesome idea, but the late 90s visual effects simply weren't up to the task of convincingly pulling this off. So we're forced to stare at what basically looks like a JPEG of the actress's head, awkwardly motion tracked on top of some overly shiny digital tentacles. Now, the film does get away with it because it's basically a B-movie anyway, but it looks undeniably ghastly and not in a good way. Cardboard cutout of a lady on fire. Exorcist 2: The Heretic. Exorcist 2: The Heretic is without a doubt one of the worst sequels ever made to a major hit movie, but it at least begins with a suitably disturbing sequence in which a priest attempts to exorcise a possessed South American girl that ultimately results in her being burnt alive. For the most part, the scene is unsettling as hell, that is, until you realise that the shots of the girl burning up were actually achieved by awkwardly compositing the actress onto a cardboard cutout. When you're watching this, pay close attention to the arms in particular, and you'll see that they don't even really resemble the definition of actual human arms. Someone just cut out a rough, vaguely human-shaped outline, hung a dress on it, and considered it good enough to set fire to. All in all, this is like the 59th thing wrong with the movie, but still, once you see it, you'll never unsee it. The T800s Eye Surgery, The Terminator. James Cameron's The Terminator is another film that understandably gets cut a lot of slack considering the sheer ambition of the director's $6.4 million sci-fi horror masterpiece. While the stop-motion Terminator endoskeleton near the end of the movie sticks out plenty, that's actually not the focus of this entry, as it actually looks a bit goofier in motion than it does when it's paused. However, the same cannot be said for the scene where the T800 removes its damaged eye. For as eerie as it undeniably is, the shot where Cameron focuses on the rubbery prop Arnold Schwarzenegger head looks a little bit daft. Again, it's important to remember the context of the production, but given the fact that the rest of the scene is sensibly filmed with profile shots to largely disguise the budgetary constraints, this one shot feels pretty out of place. Ash's fake head. Alien. Ridley Scott's Alien, for the most part anyway, is a masterclass in subtlety of building tension through atmosphere and what you don't see rather than relying on splashy effects. Scott smartly keeps the xenomorph concealed for most of the film, ensuring that the artifice of its creation never draws too much attention to itself. There are still a couple of iffy special effects shots though, most notably during the sequence where malevolent android Ash is burnt to a crisp for trying to murder Ripley. Though Ash's talking severed head was achieved through the elegantly simple practicality of having actor Ian Holm poke his head through a hole in the table, for any shots where Ash is moved around, an unconvincing dummy head replaced the actor. And so when Ripley knocks Ash's head over, the cut between Holm and the prop is comically jarring. Not to mention that when Parker torches Ash with a flamethrower, it's momentarily clear that the prop has no articulation of Ash's facial features like at all. For an otherwise magnificently crafted film, this one definitely sticks out. Deacon Frost's final form. Blade. Tragically, Blade has never really gotten the credit it deserves as a groundbreaking R-rated superhero movie, paving the way for the genre's unfathomable success today. And for my money, this first movie is the best in the whole franchise, though I'm not going to get annoyed if you do prefer the equally stunning second film, though I might have a few words if you try to bring Blade Trinity into the mix. However, Blade also shows how far superhero films have come technically, given the rather mixed bag of VFX on offer in this first flick. This is especially true during the final showdown between Blade and the megalomaniacal vampire Deacon Frost. Though Frost's explosive death is pretty bad, the most egregious moment comes shortly prior, when Blade slices him in half with a sword, but Frost ingeniously uses his newly acquired blood god powers to just piece himself back together. Cue an outrageously bad CGI animation of Frost's blood pooling together and reforming his body, which even back in 1998 looked pretty poor, all the more so if you dared pause it and just see how low res the digital gore actually is. That's not Anne Ramsey, Deadly Friend. Even if you've never seen Wes Craven's 1986 cult favourite Deadly Friend, there's a good chance you've seen the movie's most iconic scene, where the cybernetically enhanced Samantha throws a basketball at the head of neighbour Elvira. The impact of the basketball hilariously explodes Elvira's head into a gloriously bloody mess, and the sheer insanity of the practical gore effects ensures that it's a clip you'll want to watch again and again and again. But make sure to not linger on the actor in the moments before the basketball makes contact with her face, because we're very clearly not looking at actress Anne Ramsey. See, after Samantha throws the basketball and we cut to the back of Ramsey, she's actually been replaced with a rather crude mannequin that bears only the faintest passing resemblance to her. Now, the shot passes quickly enough in motion that it's not too easy to spot, but once you know there's a terrible blood-filled dummy head hiding in plain sight, well, you'll never be able to unsee it. This crew member just hanging out. I Spit in Your Grave, 1978. I Spit on Your Grave is a film you probably won't want to pause anyway, considering the utterly stomach-churning nature of its narrative. From its subject matter through to its micro-budget production, it's a film that makes you want to shower the second you're done watching it. But if you keep your eyes peeled in the early going when Jennifer flees her attackers in the woods, you'll find one of the most glaring mistakes in the history of the horror genre. See, on the far left side of the screen, a crew member can be seen just hanging out watching the scene unfold. Given that they appear to be holding a pole of some kind, we can probably assume that they're a member of the sound department holding a boom mic, though if you want to make the narrative even more harrowing than it is, then you can just convince yourself that the crew member is actually some random bystander in the woods who just decides to ignore Jennifer's attack. Candymans Harness, Candyman 1992. If the original Candyman is proof of anything, it's that even the most terrifying of horror icons needs a little sneaky help from time to time. In the movie's third act, Helen Lyle is committed to a psychiatric hospital, and in an attempt to prove the existence of Candyman to her psychiatrist Dr. Burke, she summons him by saying his name 5 times into the nearby mirror. And indeed, Candyman soon appears behind Dr. Burke, slicing his back open with his hook hand and promptly killing him. After this, Candyman flies backwards out of the room's window and disappears, but if you look closely, you might just notice the safety harness visible above actor Tony Todd's head. Now, this harness is also additionally visible earlier in the scene when Candyman first appears behind Dr. Burke, suggesting that Todd was rigged up throughout the entire sequence. Johnny's Dummy, Night of the Living Dead, 1990. Audiences have thankfully come round to Tom Savini's 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead more in recent years. Yet things don't admittedly get off to the most encouraging start for eagle-eyed viewers, given that Barbara's doomed brother Johnny dies a most unintentionally comical death. As he tries to protect Barbara from the attacking zombie, he's mauled and falls onto a gravestone, killing him dead. But the shot where Johnny's head makes contact with the gravestone has very obviously replaced actor Bill Moseley with a dummy. His blank, expressionless, plasticky face and utter lack of body movement as he falls to the ground are a far cry from Johnny's visceral human struggle mere seconds earlier. Now, given Savini's standing in the industry as a peerless makeup and effects artist, it is kinda surprising that he let something so thoroughly naff looking make it into the final cut, but at least most of the movie's other effects look pretty damn great. The Snapchat filter demon face, Annabelle Creation. Annabelle Creation was, for the most part, a majorly pleasant surprise, a massively improved prequel to 2014's Annabelle, yet there's one moment that even director David F. Sandberg admits fell rather flat. See, midway through the movie, young Janice is tormented by the demonic entity Malthus, who has taken the form of the human Annabelle who died years prior. As Janice approaches Annabelle and asks her what she needs, Annabelle suddenly turns around, revealing her horrifying demonic face, which basically looks like a free Snapchat filter applied to actress Samara Lee's face. To make the moment even more unintentionally hokey, Annabelle then shouts, "Your soul," in the most over-the-top hammy way possible, conjuring more memories of Evil Dead than less of, well, The Conjuring. And hey, I love Evil Dead, but you get the sense that that's not quite what they were going for here. The obvious Freddy double, A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984. More than is the case with any other horror icon, Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger. His voice, personality, and physicality are all baked-in signatures of the character, and fans can spot an imposter coming a mile off. Case in point, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original, kicks off with Tina being hunted by Freddy in her dreams and eventually killed. Now, we all remember when she's chased down the street by Freddy, only for him to then teleport to the other end of said street and catch her off guard. This, in practice, is obviously a super basic use of doubles, as Englund himself plays the close-up version of Freddy who catches Tina by surprise, while the distant Freddy chasing after her is simply a random double in silhouette. Except once you notice it, it's kinda tough to shake the reality that the Freddy double is clearly considerably shorter in stature than Robert Englund. Wes Craven even had good fun pointing this fact out on the movie's DVD commentary, noting that the double was, quote, about 4 feet tall. Martys Rubber Face, Poltergeist, 1982. One of Poltergeist's most memorably horrific sequences sees Dr. Marty Casey envisioning himself ripping his own face off to reveal the skeleton beneath. Though the actual skin-ripping effects are fantastically, disgustingly detailed, the very first shot of the sequence isn't so persuasive. As Marty starts tending to the cut on his face, actor Martin Casella is suddenly replaced with a dead-eyed dummy. And the awkward placement of the hands touching the face makes it obvious that somebody is placed below the dummy, peeling away at the face from above. Now, it doesn't help at all either that this shot is so brightly lit, drawing even more attention to just how rubbery and lifeless Marty's face and eyes look. Thankfully, for the rest of the sequence, the bathroom is bathed in pulsing dim lights, and the plentiful gore effects are impressive enough to distract from the not remotely lifelike face. The digital zombie dog, Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City. While it's understandable that a Resident Evil movie would need to use comprehensive CGI to create grotesque undead monsters like Lickers and the Tyrant, did the filmmakers behind Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City really need to go fully digital for the zombie dogs? Halfway through this movie, Chief Irons is attacked by one of the undead canines, and rather than slap VFX on an actual dog in post-production, the entire thing appears to be 100% CG. And to say it looks horrible would be an understatement, but at least in motion in the dimly lit confines of the parking garage, it passes by quickly enough, more or less. Dare to hit the pause button on it though, and you'll see just how bad it looks in isolation. Ironically, it kinda looks like something out of a crappy video game cutscene, and is especially embarrassing considering Paul W.S. Anderson's original Resident Evil gave us brilliant practical zombie dogs almost 20 years prior. Halloran's CGI Head, Jigsaw. Even in its worst installments, the Saw franchise can be counted upon to deliver some gnarly death sequences packed with tactile, practical gore effects. At least, in theory it can. Though 2017's Jigsaw was relatively restrained in the gore department compared to its predecessors, it at least ended with a promisingly brutal final kill, as corrupt Detective Halloran had his head split into pieces by a laser cutter, courtesy of Jigsaw's apprentice Logan. Yet rather than achieve such an elaborate death scene practically, the filmmakers instead relied upon VFX, and disappointingly sloppy, unconvincing VFX at that. That's because as Halloran's head splits open, the entire effect looks like something out, again, of a video game. In the close-up shot of Halloran's face in particular, it's painfully obvious that we're not looking at a real human being, but rather a lo-fi digital model. Given that the Saw movies have mostly relied upon practical gore effects for their grandstanding death scenes, this ended the already mediocre Jigsaw on an especially underwhelming note. Tim's ill-proportioned dummy, Final Destination 2. Final Destination 2 boasts many of the strongest and most memorable deaths in the entire series, and none proves more iconic than that of poor Tim Carpenter, who meets his end when a gigantic, thick sheet of glass is accidentally dropped on him from a construction crane. Now Tim's body is near instantly obliterated by the glass, crushing his body into a bloody, pulpy mass, all the while his traumatized mother Nora watches on in horror. Unlike Jigsaw, the effect was at least achieved with totally practical effects, namely a dummy rigged up with squibs to violently explode at the moment of impact. In motion as well, Tim's death looks absolutely great. But again, if you hit the pause button at the wrong time, there are a few frames before he's turned into soup where it becomes apparent just how rubbish the dummy actually looks.
Terrible CGI everywhere. The Walking Dead. Despite being one of the most popular TV shows of the last decade plus, with episodes being budgeted at several $1 million each, it is shocking just how persistently terrible The Walking Dead's visual effects are. Hell, there are even enough hideous CGI blunders in this show that we even wrote a list on it, with by far the most infamous VFX gaffe being an embarrassingly lo-fi digital deer that shows up in the series' 7th season. This is just one of several instances of egregiously poor CGI throughout the show. There's the digital CDC building explosion, Michonne walking past burning mattresses that were created in post, and the awful green screen shot of Rick standing in front of a landfill. Not to mention the general overabundance of unconvincing CGI blood throughout the show. Basically never pause anything in this show to get a better look, because there's a good chance that it will reveal just how shamelessly AMC cut corners in order to save a little money. Yikes. The Leviathans, Supernatural. For the standards of a CW show, Supernatural boasts relatively solid production values, but there's no escaping how absolutely horrid and not in the intended way the Leviathans look. The man-eating shapeshifters typically reveal their true nature when their human faces transform into a gaping maw of jagged teeth complete with a forked tongue. It's a terrifying idea in theory, but the VFX are so uniformly cheap that they end up resembling goofy B-movie villains rather than cosmic nightmare fuel. It's easy to believe that these effects are the result of interns at the effects house being given a Friday afternoon to motion track a lo-fi 3D animation onto an actor's face. Worse still, they all looked terrible even a decade ago when these episodes originally aired. Any small measure of fear that the Leviathans still hold in your heart will surely evaporate if you dare to pause any of their so-called money shots. Mike's hairy-legged stunt double, Stranger Things. One of the show's most cited criticisms throughout the 3rd and 4th seasons has been the distractingly accelerated ages of the main cast, basically an unavoidable consequence of the show's lengthy production and, of course, the pandemic further slowing shooting. But even with the cast visibly growing up across seasons, the show's crew were a little optimistic in assuming that fans wouldn't notice the very obvious adult stunt doubles that are subbing in for the younger protagonists. In Season 3's final episode, The Battle of Starcourt, a mind flare-possessed Billy attacks the Hawkins gang, throwing Mike into a wall and causing him to fall to the floor in pain. As noticed by Redditor Major Threat on the R-Movie Mistakes thread, for a fleeting shot it is hilariously obvious that we're not looking at Finn Wolfhard. You see, Mike's legs have suddenly sprouted a wealth of hair that you'd expect from a full-grown adult male, not somebody who was just 16 years of age during shooting, and certainly not Wolfhard, whose legs are clearly shown to be relatively hairless whenever he's wearing shorts. It doesn't break the show by any means, but it is an amusing reminder of the challenges of working with a predominantly young ensemble cast. The terrible fake dog prop, Bates Motel. Now here is a moment that should be absolutely heartbreaking, and yet if you pay remote close attention it becomes completely impossible to take seriously. In the 7th episode of Bates Motel's 1st season, Norman befriends a stray dog, Juno, and after calling out to it across the road, the dog is struck and killed by a truck as it attempts to cross the road. Horrible and devastating, right? Except if you keep an eye on poor old Juno at the moment of impact, it's very clearly a cheap ragdoll, given that its small body just tumbles stiffly underneath the truck rather than, well, squishing like you'd expect from a flesh and blood animal. It shouldn't be funny, but the obviousness of this prop, even when it's out of focus as it is, totally obliterates the emotional intent of the scene, and in a feat of accidental irony, Norman then has the dead dog stuffed, so the late canine now has all the rigidity of the fake dog used to achieve her demise on the screen. Classic. Harrison's adult stunt double, Dexter. Many Dexter fans had basically lost all hope for the series as it entered its miserable 8th season, and of the many terrible moments fans care not to remember, there's a ridiculous treadmill accident that befalls Dexter's young son Harrison a few episodes from the end. While Hannah is babysitting Harrison, he decides to toy around with a treadmill and, predictably, ends up tripping and smashing his chin. It's a silly scene in of itself, albeit one made so much worse by the fact that Harrison's fall is very clearly carried out by a fully grown adult trying to fall and resemble a small injured child. There are two shots in particular where the deception is hilariously obvious, that we're looking at a stuntman several times larger than the actor in question, and the man is seemingly wearing a blonde mop of a wig in a feckless attempt to sell the illusion. It's hardly the worst thing in Season 8, and certainly not the most infuriating, but an absolute embarrassment from a show that is generally so slickly produced elsewhere. The unsettlingly terrible effects. Twin Peaks: The Return. Twin Peaks: The Return is one of the most unforgettable TV series of the last decade, a long-awaited follow-up to the legendary series that is as baffling as it is brilliant. One of the series' most divisive aspects remains its visual effects, which range from utterly mesmerizing, namely Episode 8's stunning nuclear explosion, to absolutely hideous. While some of Lynch's fans continue to argue that the low-poly, poorly textured effects were intentional, it's much easier to believe that Lynch simply lacked the budget to execute all of his ideas at a high level of fidelity, and decided instead to save the big bucks, so many of the effects wouldn't look amiss in grotty VHS tape and lo-fi video games from literally decades ago. And while the visual effects are certainly interesting, sometimes the results are so off-puttingly garish as to make The Return a genuine eyesore. Again, there are those who maintain that this was entirely on purpose by Lynch to subvert our very expectations of prestige TV with a nauseating aesthetic, but either way, you're probably better off not scrutinizing them too much for fear of seeing just how rudimentary and ugly they truly are. The Hidden Ghosts, The Haunting of Hill House, and Bly Manor. And now for something that isn't a horrible VFX gaffe or unconvincing stunt double. Mike Flanagan's sister horror series The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor were notable for many reasons, not least that Flanagan made the decision to sneakily include ghostly figures throughout each series. Fans and critics found literally dozens of ghosts cleverly concealed in plain sight throughout almost every episode of each show. Some are hidden within negative space that the viewer's eye wouldn't naturally be drawn towards, while others are disguised as general household objects, and there are even those that are only visible if you crank the brightness settings up on your TV to the extreme. As much as it might seem like a fun game to try and catch 'em all Pokemon style, for your psyche's sake it's probably best not to, because some of them are sure to give grown adults vivid nightmares. Anna's Unhinged Jaw, V, 2009. The 2009 reboot of legendary 1980s sci-fi horror miniseries V received wildly mixed reviews across its two-season run, with the one key complaint being its drastically low budget, defined by cheap sets and low-rent visual effects which failed to live up to the original show. This was most palpably felt during the reboot series' attempt to recreate the iconic scene from the 80s show where villainous alien Queen Diana unhinges her jaw and eats a live rat. Now, the original prosthetic effects certainly didn't look great, and there was clearly a ripe opportunity here to massively improve upon it with contemporary VFX, and yet when Diana's daughter Anna chows down on some squirming vermin, it somehow looks even worse. Rather than using a practical prosthetic, Anna's unhinged jaw and widely extended mouth were achieved digitally, except that it looks like ABC spent about $5 on an After Effects plugin to pull it off. More comical than disturbing, the shot of Anna dropping the terrified animal into a gaping maw looks like something out of a bad 90s FMV video game, rather than from a scene from a TV show that aired on a major network barely a decade ago. TV shows are famously produced on tight deadlines with limited VFX budgets, but come on, people can literally produce more convincing effects on their home computers these days. Peter's transformation, Hemlock Grove. Alright, I know this one might ruffle some feathers, but let's get into it. Hemlock Grove does admittedly deserve a measure of credit for combining CGI with practical effects for the physical transformations of werewolf Peter, yet it's also painfully clear watching these scenes that Netflix was a little tight with their VFX purse strings. Now, the idea behind Peter's transformation of his wolf form tearing out of his human body is really quite fantastic, but the execution is far more middling due to CGI that felt poorly dated back when it originally aired almost a decade ago. Now, the biggest issues are the hilariously bad motion tracking of the CGI yellow eyes over the actor's actual eyes, atrocious looking digital werewolf fingernails protruding from his human fingers, and embarrassingly low poly tears on his back as the transformation continues. The money shot of the werewolf's face bursting through Peter's own, now that looks pretty great, but everything else is hugely on the rough side, and it doesn't at all hold up to the scrutiny of a freeze frame. Another terrible CGI deer, American Horror Story Apocalypse. Proving that The Walking Dead didn't solely corner the market on awful CGI deer, American Horror Story Apocalypse offered up its own shockingly naff digital dough in the season's 5th episode, Boy Wonder. Near the start of the episode, Mallory uses her extensive powers to not only heal a dead deer's wounds, but also restore its youth. It's a swell idea, but a complex effect for even a well-minted TV show to pull off, and so it's not terribly surprising that they bungled it. The morphing effect from the adult to youthful deer looks, to be kind, like something out of a PS2 game and doesn't hold up to even the most casual degree of challenge. The effect was widely mocked by fans when the episode first aired back in 2018, roughly 18 months after The Walking Dead first introduced audiences to the deeply off-putting horrors of what CGI deers could be.